On the diplomatic front, President Yi is set to hold a summit with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump next Monday in Washington. For more on what to expect from the meeting, we're joined by Professor Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Pusan National University. Professor Kelly, thanks for joining us this morning.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So this will be President Yi's first trip to the U.S. since taking office in early June. Could you tell us more about the significance of this visit?
Well, the United States and Korea, of course, have been allies for a long time, and so it's wise for the heads of state to meet one another on a regular basis, right? I believe every South Korean president has met his or her U.S. counterpart within 6 months of taking office. This is not unanticipated. In fact, I think everybody really expected this to happen. The issues are a little bit trickier than usual now. I imagine we'll get to this, but the tariffs have become sort of a real issue, right? It's in the Korean papers all the time. And I think there's also some discussion about security. It's going to be pretty tricky because the United States really wants U.S. forces and U.S. allies in East Asia to begin focusing on China. This is something that's really sensitive, particularly for progressive governments in South Korea. And so I have the feeling that this summit, if they really get in and discuss the issues, could be there could be a lot of disagreement.
Right, like you said, a lot of tricky issues. And President Yi has previously talked about pursuing pragmatic diplomacy, sort of centered on national interests. Do you think we'll see that in action when he meets President Trump next week?
Yeah, so the Americans have kind of read this to mean that South Korea is going to be softer on North Korea and China and tougher on Japan. This is something that you would expect from progressive governments in Korea, and that has traditionally led to tension with the United States, right? We saw that really clearly when Moon Jae-in was president, right? It got so bad between Korea and Japan that the U.S. had to step in. I think the Americans are really concerned that that kind of thing is going to happen again. Although I would point out in passing that the Trump government is significantly less concerned about that than the Biden or the Obama government, right? I mean, Donald Trump just doesn't care about U.S. allies as much as other U.S. presidents have. So if Korea, Japan really goes off the rails, I don't actually know if the Americans will step in as they have in the past. But generally speaking, if South Korea wants to be a U.S. ally, that means it's a U.S. ally, and that means it's got to sort of more or less stay within the frame, if you will, on U.S. behavior in East Asia, right? So if South Korea really goes freelancing on China, for example, that's going to be a real problem. And I think the Lee government has been hearing this behind the scenes from U.S. think tankers and from the American foreign policy community. And I think they're kind of in a bit of a bind here because I think the Lee government would like to do stuff that sort of expresses this independence, right? But, the cost of that could be declining or thinning U.S. alliance ties.
Right, and on North Korea says South Korea can't be its diplomatic partner, even as Seoul, tries to ease sort of tensions with Pyongyang. Could the meeting between Presidents Lee Jae-myung and Donald Trump open the door to talks with Kim Jong-un?
It looks like the North Korean government just does not want to talk to the South Korean government. I have to admit, I find that kind of surprising. Traditionally, progressive governments in South Korea have been willing to sort of meet North Korea, certainly far more than conservative governments. If you're North Korea, progressive governments, the opportunity for you to look for a deal. So I'm kind of surprised it doesn't happen. It is possible that Donald Trump could reopen diplomacy with North Korea, but to be honest, if I were the North Koreans, I would be awfully skeptical about that, right? And we all remember 2018, 2019, it was all kind of thrown together. Nothing really came out of it. The Trump people showed up in Hanoi without any real sense of what to ask for. When the one deal fell apart, they both just kind of stormed out of the room and canceled the lunch. I would be awfully surprised if the North Koreans were to come back for that without something much more concrete from the U.S. and South Korean side. And perhaps that'll be a part of the summit, but I don't know, given how intransigent the North Koreans have been recently.
I see. In South Korea and the United States, they kicked off their annual military drills this week. And a lot of attention is now on how the Korean government will handle the security issue, especially the cost sharing for American troops stationed here in Korea. How do you see that playing out?
I would imagine that Donald Trump at the summit, or at least through his negotiators later, will ask for a substantial expansion in the special measures agreement payment. Right now, roughly the Koreans pay about half, which is about $1 billion. I would imagine that Donald Trump is going to ask for double or triple or quadruple that figure. He's done this in the past. We know that Donald Trump often sort of measures foreign policy success in terms of dollars brought in. That's how he markets the tariffs. That's how he's talked to Ukraine, right? He's really pushing the Ukrainians hard to make these big commitments to buy American weapons. And so I think South Korea needs to really think about this, right? Is it worth paying the Americans more for the alliance? or not. I mean, this is just not the Biden administration anymore, the sort of belief and sort of shared values, and we're in this together. The Trump people just don't think that way, right? And the Trump people want to see the money on the table. And I think the South Koreans are going to struggle with that. My own sense is that it's actually a really good bargain for South Korea. South Korea is quite a wealthy country. Paying more for a world-class security commitment from the world's only superpower strikes me as a really, really good bargain. But I think there's a real problem. There's a real issue of sort of national pride and humiliation, a perception that South Korea was snubbed by Trump and is sort of paying him off. If that's how this thing gets marketed, the South Korean public's going to turn against it.
Right, I guess we'll have to see how that plays out next week. All right, Professor Kelly, thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.